In a small corner of the city where dreams often came to die, there existed a restaurant owner who feeds unemployed workers for free, never knowing one would win the lottery and remember her. Elena Morales stood at the steamy window of her modest diner, Elena's Kitchen, watching the November rain turn the sidewalk into a mirror, reflecting the gray desperation of the neighborhood. Her weathered hands, marked by 43 years of chopping, stirring, and serving, rested against the cool glass as her eyes followed the hunched figures hurrying past. The economic collapse had hit this industrial district like a silent hurricane. The factory closures came first, then the layoffs spread like contagion through the community. Elena had watched as familiar faces disappeared from her lunch counter, their absence more telling than any news report. Her own restaurant teetered on the edge of financial ruin, yet something deeper than business sense kept her doors open each morning. "You're going to kill yourself trying to save everyone else." Marco, her son, had argued just yesterday, pointing at the mounting bills spread across their small office desk. "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage, Mama. We can't feed the whole neighborhood for free." Elena had only smiled that particular smile, the one that had appeared when Marco's father left them 20 years ago, the one that emerged when the doctor had told her about the mass in her breast 5 years back, the one that said she had already survived impossible things. "We feed them until we can't," she had answered simply. Now, as the evening descended, bringing with it a bitter chill that seeped through the old building's bones, Elena moved away from the window toward the kitchen. The dinner rush, such as it was these days, had dwindled to a few regulars who could still afford to pay. But Elena knew that in 30 minutes, the real evening would begin. At precisely 7 o'clock, she flipped the sign on the door from "open" to "closed," but she didn't lock it. Instead, she returned to the kitchen and surveyed the extra food she had deliberately prepared: a large pot of hearty chicken stew, 2 trays of fresh-baked bread, and a mountain of roasted vegetables. Enough to feed at least 20 people. Enough to keep hope alive, if only for one more night. The first tentative knock came at 7:15. Elena wiped her hands on her faded apron and opened the door to reveal Michael Keegan, a former foreman at Westbrook Manufacturing. 6 months ago, he'd worn crisp button-downs and carried a clipboard with authority. Now his shoulders slumped beneath a thinning jacket, and his once confident gaze remained fixed on the threshold he hesitated to cross. "Evening, Elena," he mumbled, the shame of his circumstances written in the lines that had deepened around his mouth. "Michael," she answered warmly, stepping aside. "Come in before you catch your death out there." One by one they arrived, the forgotten casualties of corporate decisions made in faraway boardrooms, workers with calloused hands and diminished spirits. Some Elena had known for years, others were new faces, drawn by whispered rumors of a place where dignity came served alongside a hot meal. Among the newcomers that night was a man Elena hadn't seen before. Tall and rail-thin, with eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to focus properly, he lingered at the back of the small crowd, uncertain. His clothes, once good quality, hung from his frame like memories of a different life. As the others found seats at the tables Elena had pushed together to create a communal dining space, this stranger remained standing, watching. There was something in his stillness that caught Elena's attention, a kind of hollowed-out presence that spoke of losses beyond mere employment. Elena approached him slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "You're welcome here," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. No questions asked. The man, he looked to be in his mid-30s, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply in his throat. His voice cracked, forcing him to start again. "I don't want charity." Elena shook her head. "This isn't charity, senor. This is community." She gestured toward the tables. "We all need help sometimes. Tonight I can help with food. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe you will be the one helping someone else." A tremor passed through him, subtle but unmistakable. For a moment Elena thought he might turn and flee. Instead, he gave a barely perceptible nod and followed her to the last empty chair. His name, he eventually told her as she refilled his bowl with stew, was David Collier. He'd been an accountant at Meridian Technologies until the mass layoffs 4 months ago. Beyond that, he offered no information, and Elena asked for none. She had learned that hunger came in many forms, and some were more easily addressed than others. What she couldn't know, what no one in that warm, steamy restaurant could possibly have guessed, was that David Collier carried more than unemployment in his hollow gaze. The day before, he had placed his last $5 on a lottery ticket, a desperate prayer disguised as a game of chance. And in his pocket, folded and refolded until the paper had gone soft as cloth, he carried a notice that would change everything, if only he could find the courage to believe it was real. But that revelation would come later. For now, there was only this moment, a man who had forgotten how to hope accepting a bowl of stew from a woman who refused to stop believing in the power of simple kindness. As the weeks passed, David became a regular at Elena's evening meals. Unlike some who came and went as their fortunes changed, he appeared each night at 7:15 precisely, as if keeping an appointment with the only stability left in his world. He spoke little, but Elena noticed that his eyes had begun to focus again, registering details they had previously drifted past. December arrived with unusual bitterness, blanketing the city in snow that quickly transformed from picturesque to problematic. Elena's heating bill soared along with her food costs. Marco's warnings grew more urgent, his voice tightening with the strain of watching his mother's life's work slip away. "The bank called again," he told her one afternoon as they prepped for the day. His hands moved mechanically through the familiar task of chopping onions, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. "They're talking about foreclosure proceedings after the new year." Elena's knife paused over the chicken she was deboning. The weight of responsibility pressed against her chest, momentarily heavier than she could bear. She thought of all the faces that had come to depend on her evening meals, not just for sustenance, but for the dignity and community they provided. "We still have the catering deposit from the Henderson wedding," she said finally, resuming her work with deliberate focus. "That will cover this month's payment." Marco set down his knife. "And what about January? February?" "Mama, I've run the numbers every way possible. There's no math that makes this sustainable." Elena looked up at her son, this beautiful man who had her determination and his father's practical mind. She understood his fear. She shared it. But there were different kinds of calculations in life, different ways of measuring value. "Some things can't be captured in numbers, mijo," she said gently. "Some debts we pay forward, not back." Marco opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it as the bell above the door announced their first customer of the day. The conversation wasn't over, merely postponed. They both knew the reality couldn't be held at bay forever. That evening, David arrived at his usual time, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. Elena noticed he wore a scarf she hadn't seen before, clearly second-hand but in good condition. A small improvement, perhaps, but in these times, any forward movement deserved acknowledgement. "You look warmer tonight," she commented as she ladled beef stew into his bowl. David's hand moved self-consciously to the scarf. "Job interview tomorrow," he said, the words coming out awkwardly as if he'd forgotten how to share good news. "Nothing certain, but it's something." Elena felt a surge of pleasure warm her chest. "That's wonderful, David. The first step back is always the hardest." He nodded, looking down at his food. "I wouldn't have made it this far without—" He gestured vaguely at the restaurant, at Elena, at everything her kindness represented. "This place. It's been more than just meals." The simple acknowledgement touched Elena deeply. Most of her evening guests, as she called them, expressed gratitude, but few articulated the deeper significance of what happened in this space. That David could see it, could name it, felt like confirmation that she was right to continue, despite the mounting costs. "Eat," she said, her voice gruff with emotion she preferred not to display. "You need strength for tomorrow." As she turned to serve others, she missed the way David's eyes followed her, and the subtle movement of his hand to his coat pocket, where a secret still waited to be revealed. The job interview didn't pan out for David, nor did the two that followed in the weeks after. January arrived with an even deeper freeze, both in temperature and in Elena's finances. She had taken to keeping the restaurant colder during the day to save on heating, wearing fingerless gloves as she cooked. The evening meals continued, but she had been forced to scale back, serving simpler fare and limiting portions in ways that pained her. Marco had stopped arguing and started working double shifts at his second job, a silent concession that he wouldn't fight his mother's mission, but would do everything in his power to support it. Elena saw the exhaustion etched into his young face and added it to the weight of her own worry. On a particularly brutal Tuesday in mid-January, when the wind howled through every crack in the old building and the street outside remained eerily empty of even the most determined customers, Elena faced a decision she had been avoiding for weeks. The gas company had left a final notice: pay by Friday or service would be disconnected. The amount due was more than she could possibly gather in 3 days. For the first time since she had begun offering free meals, Elena considered not opening the restaurant that evening. The thought brought tears to her eyes as she stood alone in the cold kitchen, surrounded by the implements and ingredients of her life's purpose. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when a knock at the front door startled her back to awareness. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a vague silhouette. Probably Marco, she thought, having forgotten his key again. But when she opened the door, it was David who stood there, his thin face reddened by the cold. "We're not open yet," she said automatically, then immediately regretted the unwelcoming words. David shifted uncomfortably. "I know. I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping to talk to you. Privately." He glanced past her into the empty restaurant. "Is this a bad time?" Elena hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Come in before you freeze. I was just making tea to warm these old bones." She led him to a table near the kitchen, the only area where the heating was still turned up to a reasonable level. As she busied herself preparing 2 cups of tea, she noticed David seemed unusually agitated, his hands fidgeting on the tabletop. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting a steaming mug before him. David wrapped his fingers around the warm ceramic, a small comfort against the greater chill of uncertainty. "No," he said honestly. "And yes. I've been trying to find the right way to do this for weeks now, and I keep failing." Elena settled into the chair across from him, concern creasing her brow. "Do what, David?" He took a deep breath, then reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. It was worn around the edges, as if it had been carried for a long time. With trembling fingers, he placed it on the table between them. "I won," he said simply. Elena stared at the envelope, not comprehending. "Won what?" "The lottery. Back in November. Right before I first came here." The words tumbled out now, gaining momentum. $12 million. I've had the ticket verified. It's real." Elena felt her heart skip a beat, then resume at a faster pace. "Dios mío," she whispered. "David, that's incredible. But why have you been coming here if—" She gestured around the humble restaurant. David's eyes, so often downcast during his visits, now held hers with unexpected intensity. "I was going to kill myself that night," he said, the starkness of the statement hanging in the cold air between them. "I'd lost everything, my job, my apartment, my fiancé left. I bought that ticket with literally the last money I had. And then when I won, it felt wrong, like some cosmic joke." He paused, his fingers still resting on the envelope. "I couldn't process it. I was standing in the rain outside the convenience store, holding this piece of paper worth millions, and I felt nothing. I walked for hours, ended up in this neighborhood. And then I saw your place, saw people going in even though the sign said closed." Elena remembered that night, remembered David standing at the back of the room, looking lost. "You fed me," he continued. "But more than that, you looked at me like I was still a person, worth something. You created this space where people could remember their dignity." His voice cracked slightly. "I kept coming back because this place, what you do here, it saved my life in a way that money never could have." Elena felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "David, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish while I still have the courage." He pushed the envelope toward her. "I want to pay off your mortgage, renovate this place, create a foundation that will ensure you can keep feeding people for as long as you want to." Elena stared at the envelope, unable to form words. This wasn't charity being offered. She understood that instinctively. This was something far more profound, a circle completing itself. Kindness answering kindness. "Why now?" she finally managed to ask. David's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if unburdened by the secret he'd carried for so long. "I've been meeting with financial advisors, lawyers, trying to figure out how to do this properly. I wanted everything in place before I approached you." A small, hesitant smile appeared. "Also, I needed to be sure I wasn't still crazy, that this was the right thing to do." "And is it?" Elena asked softly. "The only right thing," he answered without hesitation. "You saved me when the money couldn't. Now let the money save this place." Outside, the winter wind continued its assault on the old building, finding every weakness in its worn exterior. But inside, in the small circle of warmth they had created, something extraordinary was taking root, a transformation neither could have imagined just months before. The renovation of Elena's kitchen began in February, during the coldest part of the year. David insisted the restaurant remain open throughout the process, setting up a rotation of food trucks in the parking lot to ensure the evening meals continued without interruption. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the miraculous turn of events, and the story took on almost mythical proportions with each retelling. Elena found herself thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight as local news stations picked up the story. Restaurant angel rewarded. Read one headline, "Kindness comes full circle," proclaimed another. She endured the interviews with gracious discomfort, always redirecting attention to the community's needs rather than her own role. "I just fed people," she told a particularly persistent reporter. "That's what I know how to do." But it had been more than that, and everyone who had ever stepped through her doors in those desperate evening hours knew it. She had created a sanctuary where worth wasn't measured by employment status or financial security, where dignity was served alongside soup and bread. David, for his part, blossomed under the purpose the project gave him. With his accounting background, he managed the financial aspects of both the renovation and the newly established Elena's Community Kitchen Foundation with meticulous care. The hollowness that had characterized him during those first visits gradually filled with something new. Not happiness exactly, but a steady contentment that smoothed the sharp edges of his former despair. Marco watched these developments with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "I still can't believe it," he confided to his mother one evening as they reviewed the architectural plans for the expanded kitchen. "All those nights I worried we were going under, and the solution was sitting right at our tables." Elena smiled, running her finger along the blueprint's neat lines. "Not a solution, mijo. A person. Remember that." By April, the transformation was complete. The renovated Elena's kitchen gleamed with new equipment and expanded seating, but Elena had insisted on maintaining the core character of the space. The worn wooden counter where she had served thousands of meals, the hand-painted mural of her hometown in Mexico that covered the back wall, the mismatched vintage light fixtures that cast a warm glow over the dining room. The grand reopening was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Elena arrived at dawn, needing these quiet hours alone in the new old space to center herself before the day's events. She moved through the kitchen, touching each surface, reacquainting herself with the heart of her domain. So much had changed in 6 months. The crushing weight of financial ruin had lifted. The restaurant was secure, the foundation established, the evening meals now a formalized program with proper funding and support. Yet as she stood in the pre-dawn stillness, Elena felt a curious emptiness beneath her gratitude. The bell above the door jingled softly, and she turned to find David entering, carrying a small potted plant. "You're here early," she observed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, setting the plant on the counter. "Thought you might like this for today. It's an orange jasmine. They're supposed to bring good fortune." Elena touched one of the plant's glossy leaves. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." David studied her face in the gentle morning light. In the months they had worked together on the renovation, he had developed an attunement to her moods. "Something's bothering you," he said, not a question. Elena sighed, turning to put on a pot of coffee. "Nothing should be bothering me. Everything is perfect now." "But," David prompted, settling onto one of the counter stools. Elena measured coffee grounds, considering how to articulate the nebulous concern floating at the edges of her consciousness. "I'm wondering if we've lost something in all this." "Improvement," she finally said. "Before, when we had nothing, when every meal might have been the last we could offer, there was a kind of holiness to it." She shook her head, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. "I sound ungrateful." "No," David said quietly. "You sound human. You're afraid success might change the essence of what made this place special." Elena looked at him with surprise. "Yes, exactly that." David was silent for a moment, watching as she set 2 coffee mugs on the counter. "When I first came here," he said slowly, "I was empty, completely hollow. I had a piece of paper worth millions in my pocket, and it meant nothing because I'd lost my reason to live." He accepted the coffee she offered, wrapping his hands around the mug as he had on so many cold evenings. "What saved me wasn't just food. It was sitting at those pushed-together tables with people who had nothing but shared everything anyway. Dignity. Stories. Bad jokes." A small smile touched his lips. "It was watching you move around the room like some kind of guardian angel in an apron, remembering everyone's names, noticing when someone didn't eat enough." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "That didn't come from your financial struggles, Elena. It came from you. And it's still you running this place." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a knot of tension beginning to loosen. "I just don't want to lose the soul of what we did," she whispered. "Then we won't." David said simply. The foundation isn't just about feeding more people, it's about creating more spaces like the one you built here. Teaching others to do what you did instinctively. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, painting the windows with the first blush of dawn. In a few hours, the restaurant would fill with people celebrating the reopening. There would be speeches and photographs, congratulations and well wishes, but in this quiet moment, something more important was being affirmed. A commitment to preserving the essential spirit that had saved them both. Elena reached across the counter and briefly covered David's hand with her own, a gesture of gratitude that transcended words. Then she straightened, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Well," she said briskly, "we have a lot to do before the doors open. The bread won't bake itself." David smiled, recognizing in her tone that the moment of doubt had passed. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said, rising from the stool. Elena pointed toward the storeroom. "Start by bringing out the flour. Today, I'll teach you my mother's recipe for pan dulce. It's time you learned." As the morning progressed and others arrived to help with preparations, Elena felt a deepening certainty that what they had built together would endure. The restaurant had been saved, yes, but more importantly, so had the spirit of community it fostered. And in that salvation, both she and David had found something neither had expected, a new beginning, fashioned from the broken pieces of what had come before. By midday, the restaurant hummed with activity. Staff, both old and newly hired, moved efficiently through their tasks under Elena's watchful guidance. The aroma of fresh bread and simmering sauces filled the air, a sensory promise of the feast to come. Among the helpers was Michael Keegan, the former foreman who had been one of Elena's regular evening guests during the worst months. He had found work again at a smaller manufacturing plant and had immediately volunteered to assist with the reopening celebrations. "Place looks amazing, Elena," he said, helping to arrange chairs around the expanded dining area. "But it still feels like your place. That's the important thing." Elena nodded, pleased by this confirmation of what David had tried to tell her earlier. "Different walls, same heart," she replied. As the official opening time approached, Elena retreated briefly to the small office at the back of the restaurant, another new addition, with a proper desk and filing cabinets replacing the card table where she and Marco had once spread out overdue bills. She needed a moment alone to compose herself before facing the crowd. She stood before the small mirror hanging on the wall, straightening her collar, tucking a stray strand of silver-streaked hair back into place. The face that looked back at her bore the same lines and character it always had, but there was a lightness now that had been absent for too long. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mama?" Marco's voice called. "It's time." Elena took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door to find not just Marco waiting, but David as well. "Ready?" David asked gently. Elena looked from one to the other, her son who had supported her through the darkest times, and this man who had arrived at her door broken and had returned with renewal. Her family, in all the ways that truly mattered. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was brief but emotional. The mayor spoke about community resilience and the power of individual action. A representative from the newly formed foundation outlined their mission to replicate Elena's model in other struggling neighborhoods. David, still uncomfortable with public speaking, managed a few heartfelt words about transformation and second chances. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she stepped forward with uncharacteristic hesitation. Public oratory had never been her strength. She had always let her food and actions speak for her. But today demanded words. "I am not good at speeches," she began, her accent more pronounced under the pressure of so many eyes upon her. "So I will be brief. Many people have called what happened here a miracle. That a man who won the lottery would choose to save a small restaurant that once fed him." She turned slightly to include David in her gaze. "But the real miracle happened long before any money changed hands." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The real miracle was that in our darkest times, when we had almost nothing to give, we chose to give anyway. All of us. Those who could pay a little did so. Those who could volunteer their time did that. We held each other up." Her voice strengthened as she continued. "This beautiful new kitchen, these resources, they are wonderful gifts, but they are not the miracle. You, all of you, are the miracle." A spontaneous burst of applause interrupted her. Elena waited for it to subside, then concluded simply, "So today we celebrate not just a new beginning for Elena's kitchen, but a continuation of what we built together when we had nothing but each other. The doors are open." The table is set. Everyone is welcome." With those words, she cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance, officially reopening the restaurant that had become so much more than a business. It had become a beacon, a symbol of what remained possible even in the hardest times. The celebration continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Regular customers mingled with community leaders, volunteers alongside journalists documenting the occasion. Food flowed abundantly from the kitchen, Elena's traditional recipes now prepared with less financial strain, but no less care. As dusk settled over the city, Elena found herself momentarily alone, watching the animated conversations and laughter filling every corner of her restaurant. She stood in the shadow of the hallway leading to the kitchen, observing rather than participating, storing away the images of joy to sustain her through whatever challenges might lie ahead. David appeared at her side, 2 small glasses of sparkling cider in his hands. He offered one to Elena. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass slightly. Elena accepted the toast with a smile. "And to remembering where we came from." They sipped in companionable silence, both content to observe the scene before them. After a moment, David spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about being afraid that the soul of this place might change." He turned to face her more directly. "I realized I never told you the whole story about that first night." Elena raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh?" David nodded, his expression growing more solemn. "After I found out I'd won the lottery, I walked for hours in the rain. I was dissociating, I think the therapist would call it now. Nothing felt real. I had this ticket worth millions in my pocket, but I couldn't connect it to any kind of future I could imagine for myself." He took another sip of his cider, gathering his thoughts. "I ended up on the Jefferson Street Bridge. It was late, almost no traffic. I stood at the railing for, I don't know how long, looking down at the water." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she understood what he was describing. "David," he continued quietly, "what stopped me wasn't the money. It was the smell of your restaurant, bread and something savory cooking. I followed it almost unconsciously. Saw people going in even though it was after hours. Something about that, about the light spilling out onto the sidewalk, the way people's postures changed as they went inside, straightening a little, like they were being restored somehow. It pulled me back from the edge." Literally and figuratively, Elena reached out and gripped his forearm tightly, unable to speak past the emotion constricting her throat. "So you see," David concluded, his voice steadier now, "it was never really about the food, though the food was excellent." A small smile softened his features. "It was about creating a space where broken people could remember they were still whole in all the ways that mattered. That's what you did. That's what you'll keep doing, fancy new kitchen or not." Elena released his arm and discreetly wiped at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "It helps to know, to understand why this place matters so much to you." David nodded. "It's not the only reason I wanted to help, of course. After I started to heal, started to really accept that the money was real and that I had a future to plan for, I knew I wanted to do something meaningful with it. Something that would create more light in the world, not just for me." He glanced around the bustling restaurant. "This place already knew how to do that. I just gave it the resources to keep going." Before Elena could respond, Marco approached, accompanied by a group of eager volunteers from the new foundation. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but these folks want to hear more about how we structured the evening meals program. I thought you could explain it better than I could, Mama." Elena straightened, smoothing her apron with an automatic gesture. "Of course," she said, then turned back to David briefly. "We'll talk more later?" He nodded, raising his glass in a small salute as she moved away with Marco and the volunteers. As the evening progressed, the celebration gradually transformed into something reminiscent of the original evening meals, less formal, more intimate. Many of the officials and media representatives had departed, leaving behind the core community that had supported Elena's kitchen through its darkest days. Just after 9 o'clock, Elena stepped out the back door of the restaurant, needing a moment of fresh air and solitude. The night was cool but not cold, spring asserting itself after the long winter. She leaned against the brick wall, tilting her head back to gaze at the few stars visible through the city's light pollution. The door opened again and David joined her, offering a steaming mug. "Thought you might want some tea?" he said. "It's getting chilly out here." Elena accepted the mug gratefully. "Thank you. I just needed a minute to breathe." David nodded, understanding without explanation. They stood side by side in comfortable silence, sipping their tea and listening to the muted sounds of conversation and laughter filtering through the walls. "It's a good beginning," Elena said finally. "Better than I could have imagined 6 months ago." "It is," David agreed. "Though I've been thinking, it's not really accurate to call it a beginning. It's more of a continuation, isn't it? A new chapter rather than a new book." Elena smiled at the distinction. "Yes, that feels right. A new chapter." She turned to look at him directly. "What about you, David? What does your next chapter hold?" He considered the question seriously. "I'm not entirely sure yet. The foundation will keep me busy for a while. I've started therapy. Should have done that years ago, honestly." A self-deprecating smile flickered across his face. "I'm learning how to live with having resources after spending so long without them. It's a stranger adjustment than people might think." "And will you stay in the neighborhood?" Elena asked, trying to keep her tone casual despite the importance she found herself attaching to his answer. David's expression softened. "I can't imagine being anywhere else," he said simply. "This is where I found my way back to myself, where I remembered how to hope." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Where you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else, including myself." The air between them seemed to grow warmer despite the evening chill, charged with unspoken possibility. Elena felt a flutter of something long dormant stirring in her chest, not just gratitude or friendship, but something with deeper roots and newer blossoms. Before either could speak again, the back door opened once more, spilling light onto the small service area where they stood. Marco poked his head out. "There you are! People are starting to leave, Mama. I think they want to say goodbye to you before they go." Elena nodded, reluctantly pushing herself away from the wall. "I'll be right there." As Marco disappeared back inside, she turned to David one last time. "We should finish this conversation soon," she said, a gentle invitation in her voice. "I'd like that," he replied, his eyes holding hers with quiet intensity. "Very much." Together they returned to the warmth and light of the restaurant, moving back into the flow of the celebration. But something had shifted. Some new understanding had taken root between them, a tender acknowledgement that the story they had begun in the darkest of times might continue to unfold in ways neither had dared to imagine. Long after the last guest had departed and the cleanup was complete, Elena stood in the center of her restaurant, absorbing the peaceful silence. The space hummed with the echoes of the day's joy and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. In the morning, they would open for regular business. The foundation would begin its work in earnest. Life would move forward with its inevitable mixture of challenges and triumphs. But for now, in this quiet moment between what had been and what would be, Elena savored the perfect fullness of her heart. "Gracias," she whispered to the empty room, to the universe, to whatever grace had brought her through the darkest winter into this unexpected spring. Outside, the city slept under a canopy of stars, while inside Elena's kitchen, hope had found a permanent home. In the warm hearth of a restaurant that had fed bodies and souls, in the renewed purpose of a man who had almost lost everything, and in the unwritten chapters still waiting to unfold between them. Some debts, Elena knew, could never truly be repaid. They could only be honored by living fully in the second chance they provided, by remembering, by continuing to set the table and open the door, trusting that there would always be enough light, enough food, enough love to share. Tomorrow would come with its own demands and gifts. But tonight, Elena stood in the center of her miracle, perfectly balanced between gratitude for what had passed and faith in what was yet to come.